Everything I say today, of course, has very little to do with reality in some ways. It's simply what people think. And the question for many of you as policy people is the extent of the gap or otherwise between perception and reality. So let's have a look. And again, all of these slides will be on the Sutton Trust website, so you can do whatever you like with them. It's interesting at the moment in Britain, despite there's a whole load of data coming out for those of you who love Twitter, which I do, this morning, of course, on real wages and the stagnation in real wages. But overall, anxiety about the economy has headed south, slight bounce after the election result, but much, much lower than it has been for a very long time. And of course, this is partly, and concern about unemployment is also, of course, relatively low. We have currently the highest ever female employment in data produced this morning. The challenge now, of course, is not about employment, but of course what sort of work and how we equip people for the sorts of work that we would like people to have. And inequality is something that we have started, we've looked at for a long time. Here's the last 20 years of data. Every month we ask the British public, without any prompting, without any lists, we just ask them to tell us what are the biggest problems facing the country. So these are spontaneous remarks or concern about poverty and inequality. And what you can see, if you use 2010 or the election of in 2010, clearly with the post-crash environment, with austerity, with cuts to benefits, you can see a much greater level of anxiety. We've moved from an economy, a country that used to be worried about unemployment in the recessions when I was growing up in the 1970s and the 1980s, to one that is now concerned about low pay, poverty and inequality. That was in December 2016, the highest score we had ever measured in this country. Now, of course, when I tweeted that this morning, immediately the experts got, yes, but Ben, actual inequality hasn't changed much since the 1980s. What are they fussing about? And I think, of course, as usual, as my friend Ben Goldacre at The Guardian and elsewhere would put it, I think you'll find it's a bit more complicated than that. And, of course, one issue is, of course, the acceleration away of the top 1% from everybody else. Income's up around 12 to 13% over the last few years, and stagnation generally. Education. Currently, we have the highest spontaneous anxiety about education in a decade. It's still much lower than at the 1997 election, where that and the NHS were the key issues concerning the electorate. But still, you can see a gradual rise from around 2009, 2010, in terms of people's anxieties. And of course, because a lot of people in Britain are old and Britain is getting older, older people generally aren't selfish, of course, and they want the best for young people, but when they're generally less likely to mention education as a key challenge facing the country. But nevertheless, so the fact that it's now the fourth most important issue behind, after terror, this is our monthly survey. Just looking at June, obviously we've had some recent terror events in London, so terrorism then goes up the scale, and then we have the NHS and Brexit at the top of the pile. So quite impressive that it was actually now ahead of education, immigration, and ahead of housing as an issue that the country is concerned about. What's going to happen? Will things get better or worse? Now, the British are generally pessimistic, and so are a lot of people in Western countries. I mean, so when you immediately see this, you think, oh gosh, we're all going to hell in a handcut. I mean, the fact is that if you take the NHS, for example, we are currently the most pessimistic country on Earth, out of 23 countries that we've studied in our annual global trend study about the future quality of health services in Britain. Actual satisfaction of the NHS is only drifting down slightly, although it is. On education, though, you can see that there is more pessimism than optimism, and on opportunities for young people, which I want to come back to. Again, more pessimism than optimism. And in some ways, the fact that people are increasingly pessimistic about the young, I think, is a real sort of leitmotif, if you like, of some of the challenges that our society now faces, because something has happened, as you will see in a second. And this is actually the highest level of pessimism about the quality of education we've ever recorded. We've got 4 out of 10 people saying it will get worse. We've tracked this back to the beginning of the century. So you can see that quite a lot of time money was pouring into education and people were still pretty pessimistic. But nevertheless, it's the first time that we've seen this move quite so decisively. So some real anxieties about what happens next. Will those amazing achievements, for example, in London, a city I moved to in the late 1980s with absolutely terrible schools, all sorts of strikes, and you could actually see the impact of those strikes on children's education in a few years on, to having, of course, some of the best schools in Britain. Will we maintain that? This is the global data on what people think about the future of young people. And you can see that all over the world, there are only about 5 countries, all of which are ones starting from a rather lower base: China, Peru, India, Indonesia, and Brazil, where the majority of people think that their young people will have a better life. Britain is pretty pessimistic, not quite as pessimistic as the French, who are absolutely professionally miserable. I speak as somebody who is on a board of a French company. Ipsos Mori is now a French company. Don't tell too many people, please. But generally this pessimism is pretty strong across the world, and it's not actually something that's always been there. Now, in our global trend study, we try and look at, with 20,000 interviews around the world and over 400 questions that we get long-suffering people to do because they're interested in the questions. We've looked at some of these undercurrents that I think much of your work, of course, is around. And there are some very striking things. And many of the challenges we face are, in a way, crystallizing at the moment. One of the key 8 trends that we've identified is what we've called the crisis of the elites, which, of course, ironically involves billionaires in lifts and as a symptom. But the fact is that people will elect somebody like Donald Trump, not because they necessarily think he's honest or tells the truth. They don't care because they're so fed up. This is data. These are the global averages, and the data for Britain and any other major country you might want to look at is freely available. Experts don't us. We do not understand their lives. 69%. I feel like a stranger in my own country. In France and America, that figure is nearly 70%. My government doesn't prioritise the interests of people like me, 71% globally. And interestingly, 76%, the economy is rigged for the advantage of the rich and powerful. Even in lovely Sweden, lovely, democratic, well-funded, in theory, Sweden, that figure is 54%. People are are dissatisfied after a long period, the end of that long period of growth in the late 20th century. Stagnation, scandal, distrust of elites, continuing decline of deference, migration, globalization, all of these things play its part. Who do we trust? Not many people. UN, 38%. The government, a quarter. Again, and these are global figures. And actually, Europeans are some of the least trusting of their governments anywhere on earth, which again is perhaps deeply skeptical. I don't know how we react to that. So some real challenges. Now, the latest study tries then to look at how people feel about what they need to get on, what will help young people get on, and the role of education, ambition, aspiration, etc. And again, do you agree or disagree that people have equal opportunities to get on? Before the crash in May 2008, the majority of people in Britain said, actually, we do have equal opportunities. It doesn't matter where you're from. I mean, there's still 34% who disagree, and there's plenty of evidence that coming from certain postcodes will give you much greater opportunity than coming from other postcodes, even in 2008. By June 2016, it's 46%, and now 4 out of 10. Still 4 out of 10 people believe that, but clearly the trend is going in the wrong direction. Some real disagreement there, that equal opportunities are actually real. And of course, who's most optimistic? Those who've had those opportunities. So wealthy people, the ABs, us in this room, of course, because we all believe in a meritocracy. The C2s, interestingly, the C2s, who of course are the people who voted for Brexit, much more similar. And the C2s, of course, are this classic group in society who are squeezed from above and squeezed from below. They are, historically, if you look, and I'm a historian, are also the people in Germany who voted for Hitler and who took part in the French Revolution, most active participants in the French Revolution in 1789. And what about the young? Are they going to have a better prospect or not? So this is, I think, what is really interesting. And I find this psychologically, I think, in terms of our society, really, really interesting. Before the crash, only 1 person in 8 thought that young people were going to have a worse life than their parents or you. That then rose to 1 in 3 people in November 2011 after the crash, and now 46%. And you've got all of those young people who finally decided perhaps we will try voting this time, much to the consternation of opinion pollsters. We didn't believe them, but they did. So real scepticism now about the prospects for young people. Now, are they right? Again, this is perception. It may not necessarily be reality. Something wonderful may happen in productivity in our economy in the 2020s, and everything will be splendid. Or it may turn out that the late 20th century was just a happy period, and we are now facing some, permanent changes in terms of people's opportunities as the centre of the world moves to the south and to the east of the planet. In terms of, who's got the most, who's optimistic, there are 29% who are cheerful. Interestingly, the very young aren't the most pessimistic. It's actually the people who have sort of left school, left university, left studying, got into the world of work or not, and perhaps had their ambitions not necessarily realised, who are the most pessimistic. And many of you, of course, who study the literature on well-being will know that happiness in the West, of course, is a shallow bowl. You're often most happy in your early 20s and your early 70s. I'm on an upward curve at the moment, so I'm looking forward to it. What would most help the disadvantaged? We've got, interestingly here on this one, private schools for those who can't afford it, access to grammar schools, good teaching in comprehensives, but all of these things, of course, in there. We'll come back to teaching in a second. What about your job? What sort of work have you got? With the job you had when your father was 16, would you say that the level or state of your job is better or worse? Now, interestingly, 4 out of 10 people say that they've gone up. Their job is of a higher grade than their father's. Or we should have said their mother, but I think we were doing a trend question, so we decided to go with the implicit sexism of the question. But although a quarter, of course, go down. And I think one thing about, and I'd be interested in the experts' views on this, social mobility means some people go up, but unless society is expanding in massive opportunity, it does mean some people have to not get there. They can't, the old Etonians can't have all those jobs anymore if other people from Walsall or wherever else are going to get them. And what this shows is that, however, is that actually the proportion of people who say they think they're going down the scale has risen from 19 to 26% over the last 25 years or so. So again, I think we need to think how we interpret that, but certainly there are plenty of people who don't feel they're moving on. And of course, then the key thing is, who are we talking about? And this is the question. The people who are saying they're doing better are ones, of course, and who are doing a better job are ones who are better qualified, who have more qualifications, and the ones who, of course, are worse off now. Is this cause or effect that we're looking at here? But the people on the lowest incomes, of course, are saying that they're dropping down the social scale relative to their parents. 40% with an income of below 10k are saying they've now got a lower type. They have a lower job or employment than their father. What really then matters? Hope springs eternal. And ambition, everybody will say that just as long as you're ambitious, it will be fine. The difficulty is that we know that ambitious people from certain types of schools and settings do better than ambitious people from other types of schools and settings. And we also have, of course, 54% saying knowing the right people would help. Lots of, there's quite a lot of denial about coming from a wealthy family or having clever parents. People sort of split on that. But pretty clear about connections. And the direction of travel on this is clear. Ambition and education, every time these questions have been asked since the 1980s, have been at the top. But for the first time, we have many more people saying knowing the right people matters. It's about your connections. And interesting to reflect on whether social media makes that better or worse. People are more connected in many ways now, in all sorts of ways, than they were 20 years ago. So that's there. And then, of course, the thing at the bottom, coming from wealthy family, again, one of the, a clear shift in the last few years. So some concerns, I think, about the fact that if you believe in a meritocracy rather than just who you know, there may be some challenges in the environment that we now find ourselves in. Are we at risk of heading backwards? And what's going to make a difference? Well, I think they've nailed it here. High quality teaching in comprehensives, lower tuition fees. Those are the things that people are identifying. So, and these are the public. These are not experts, so they're pretty clear about what matters. And when you look at who that might be, and again, this is interesting for government. I mean, access to grammar schools not really seen as an absolute obsession of the British public. Of course, we know that many people would choose to send their children to a private school if it was free. But overall, people want something that is more likely to increase fairness, higher quality teaching in comprehensive schools. Slightly wealthier people above the national average are more likely to say that, and older people. Interestingly, the young themselves, of course, very concerned about debts starting out, actually more likely than average somewhat to mention lower tuition fees at universities. Grammar schools, again, not really moving, and again, DEs at the bottom of the pile, a bit more likely to say private schools. But overall, the public is pretty clear that it is concerned about the quality of teaching in schools, and it will want to see what the government is going to deliver in that area. So, I mean, in summary, I think some tough messages. Many of the things that we've seen in politics and society over the last 2 or 3 years, in a sense, were not sort of strange things that suddenly happened. There isn't suddenly authoritarian right-wing populism sweeping the world. That is not true. What is true is that the conditions and dissatisfaction have mounted, and they crystallize in particular moments. The general election, and again, the election that might happen now, if we're honest, sometime fairly soon, again, may see more crystallization of that. But the underlying conditions are not going to go away quickly, and they are going to be there for some time. So we've got rising concern about inequality. We've got a lot of pessimism. We've got more people saying it's about who you know. We've got recognition that investment in teaching in comprehensives matters. But it's, of course, we also have to remind ourselves, for people who are obsessed about education, it's not actually still the public's top priority. I think the interesting thing to me is, are we at some sort of tipping point? And of course, you never know until after the event. Hindsight is always a wonderful thing. But we might be. Thank you.